Well, this week I've got on another vintage t-shirt. It says on one side, got 5, and on the back side, Super Bowl rings. Anybody remember Super Bowl rings? It was a while back. Last time I shared that the radiologist suggested that I have 2 or 3 years to live. I finally began radiation and a new round of chemo this week. They told me that things would probably be easy for 3 weeks and then hard the last 2. But after only 3 days of the new treatments, I'm wasted. I have no energy. I hope I can stay awake for this. It took me several times longer to put together this material than normal. I'm hoping that this is not just the treatment, but the fact that I got a lot less sleep this week. I work until 3:30 a.m. and normally come home and grade papers for the college classes I teach. So I usually go to bed about 6:30 and sleep until 2:30. Well, this week I had to do radiation between 11:30 and 1, and that messed up my sleeping. I made it to 67 without needing sleep, but now for the first time in my life, sleep is very important. Anyway, pray that I can adjust to the new schedule and get enough sleep. I got some more sobering news this week. My cancer marker numbers in my blood had dropped from 2100 to the 70s. However, after 6 weeks without chemo, my markers are back up again to 370. But hopefully the radiation and new chemo will beat them down again. Years ago, Chuck Swindoll preached a sermon on Habakkuk. And the week he was preparing for it, he decided to ask individuals he came into contact with what Habakkuk meant to them. Well, the secretary told him that it was a Jewish holiday. A waitress told him that it was a village in Vietnam. A teen said that it was a new horror movie. A merchant thought Swindoll was trying to sell him something and said he wasn't interested. Another person explained that it was a game, but that they had never played it. Someone else said that it was a type of fish. And an older gentleman told him that it was a disease of the lower back. Habakkuk has not gotten nearly the respect that it deserves. It's one of my favorite minor prophets. The book begins with a one-verse introduction, the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. Now, what do we know about Habakkuk? Basically, only that he was a prophet and he wrote this book. You might remember that there are 3 basic periods in the history of Israel in the Old Testament. There was first the United Kingdom under Saul, David, and Solomon, but then the kingdom split into 2. The northern kingdom was called Israel, and if you're like me, you have a hard time remembering things, and so I've always remembered that I comes before J, and when I look at a map, I tend to start with north. So Israel, is the northern kingdom that was made up of 10 tribes, and Judah, was the southern kingdom made up of Judah and Benjamin. Israel, the northern kingdom, was taken over by the Assyrians in 722 BC, and Judah, the southern kingdom, was taken over by the Babylonians in 586 BC. The book of Habakkuk was written about 600 BC, when Judah was forgetting God and declining spiritually and morally. Meanwhile, Babylon was rising and would later take over Judah. Habakkuk is uniquely the only minor prophet where the nation Judah is never directly addressed. The prophets generally speak for God in announcing the judgment to a nation, but all of Habakkuk is a series of dialogues and prayers between the prophet and God. The book has 2 major sections. Chapters 1 and 2 record Habakkuk's twice complaining to the Lord and the Lord's 2 responses. Chapter 3 records Habakkuk's praise. So let me just begin to read to you some of Habakkuk's first complaint in chapter 1. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear, or cry to you violence, and you will not save? So why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. Habakkuk complains to God about how wicked his people have become, and the fact that God is not doing anything about it. He's thinking, God, are you there? Do you even care? Are you really in control? Are you really good? Rabbi Howard Kushner, in his popular but I wouldn't recommend book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, says, there's only one question which really matters: why do bad things happen to good people? All other theological conversation is intellectually diverting. So how does God respond to Habakkuk's complaint? He says that he's going to raise up Babylon to discipline Judah. Verses 5 to 11 of chapter 1. Look among the nations and see, wonder and be astonished. For I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, also known as Babylon, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth upon them from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. They all come for violence, all their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep by like the wind and go on, guilty men whose own might is their God. This would be something like God saying to us, okay, America, since you won't bow the knee, I'm going to have North Korea nuke you. Our response would be, well, why them? Why such a godless nation? Habakkuk longs for God to reform his people, but not with such wicked warriors. The rest of Habakkuk 1 and chapter 2 continue these same things. Then in chapter 3, Habakkuk prays for God's intervention. The first two verses, he says, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet. O Lord, I have heard the report of you and your work. O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years revive it. In the midst of the years make it known. In wrath remember mercy. So he prays for God's intervention to bring mercy rather than just his wrath. And then in verses 3 to 15, God reminds Habakkuk of his interventions. God has in the past and will in the future intervene on behalf of his people. In other words, God responds to Habakkuk's prayer by saying, I will discipline Judah, but I will also deliver them. And so with this promise from God, Habakkuk rejoices in the Lord in the last 4 verses of the book, verses 16 to 19 of chapter 3. But his rejoicing begins with recognizing. Before he can rejoice, he must remember who God is and who he is. And after doing this, Habakkuk responds in verse 16, I hear, and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. God's truth, God's revelation of himself, has an emotional impact on Habakkuk. Similar to when God spoke to Moses in the burning bush, or initially called Isaiah, or after God answered Job, Habakkuk is humbled before the Lord. Trusting and obeying, God should not be driven by emotions, but they should be, nevertheless, emotional responses. We should not be emotionalists, but we should be emotional. We should, as Jonathan Edwards emphasized, have holy affections for God. So after Habakkuk remembers who God is and is humble and repentant before him, Habakkuk responds, Yet I will wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. God, as horrible as it sounds, I trust in you and your plan. Furthermore, Habakkuk says, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herds in the stalls. In other words, in our context, though it's 2020 and COVID and racial and political strife, though I'm dying from cancer, Habakkuk says, even if we're starving to death, I will rejoice, verse 18, yet will I rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on high places. Habakkuk adopts neither fatalism nor stoicism nor passive resignation, but rather joyful trust. Rather than complaining or questioning God's sovereign will, he now joyfully submits to it. Habakkuk's trembling has been transformed into triumphant trust. As Hudson Taylor said, it doesn't matter how great the pressure is, but only where the pressure lies. In other words, the size of our faith is determined by the size of our God. Habakkuk's words here remind me of Job 13:15. Though he slay me, I will trust in him. William Cowper was born in England in 1731. His father was one of King George's II's chaplains, but his mother died when he was 6 and he was sent off to boarding school, and it didn't go well. Nevertheless, by the time he was 18, he was a lawyer's apprentice, but battling depression and had a mental breakdown. Thus he ended up in an asylum. But while there one day, he found a Bible and read John 11 about Jesus raising Lazarus, and then read Romans, and while reading Romans 3, he was converted to faith. After he left the asylum, he ended up at John Newton's church. Newton, as many of you know, had been a slave trader, but now was a pastor and authored the hymn Amazing Grace. Newton knew of Cowper's poetic gifts and challenged him to write hymns. He went on to write at least 68 of them. And one of his most famous is God Moves in a Mysterious Way. God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. Deep in unfathomable minds of never-failing skill, he treasures up his bright designs and works his sovereign will. Ye fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds you so much dread are big with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence he hides a smiling face. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. Blind unbelief is sure to err and scan his work in vain. God is his own interpreter, and he will make it plain. Cowper also wrote another hymn that was based on Habakkuk 3, entitled In Him Confiding. And he wrote, Though vine nor fig tree neither their wonted fruits should bear, though all the fields should wither, nor flocks nor herds be there, yet God, the same abiding, his praise shall tune my voice, for while in him confiding, I cannot but rejoice. I'm going to put a link with this outline to a great song by Shane and Shane called Though He Slay Me. See you in a couple weeks.